The wind moved like a living thing over the cold Atlantic, dragging long waves under a sky without stars. It was the kind of night that felt heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Somewhere in that dark space, far from land, a British aircraft carrier pushed through the water. Its lights were dim, its engines steady, its deck crowded with young men who tried not to think about how close they were to death. High above them, clouds rolled like mountains in the sky, thick and unforgiving. Rain slapped the ocean. The wind howled across the carrier's metal skin. And inside that storm, inside that noise, a small aircraft waited. Fragile, slow, made of wood and canvas. A Swordfish torpedo bomber. No one looking at it would imagine it could change the course of the war. No one looking at it would believe this little machine could challenge a giant born of steel and fire. But tonight, this slow, outdated aircraft would rise into the storm and do something almost impossible. It would cripple the most powerful battleship ever built. The Bismarck. She moved somewhere out there in the darkness, huge, silent, deadly. A floating fortress with guns taller than a man, armor thicker than anything the British Navy had ever faced. She had already sunk the pride of the Royal Navy, HMS Hood, in a single violent explosion that killed more than 1,400 sailors in minutes. She had slipped through patrol lines, dodged aircraft, and threatened Britain's lifeline, the convoys that fed an entire nation. If the Bismarck reached the open ocean, she would destroy everything in her path. No merchant ship would be safe. No convoy would survive. Britain, already starving, could collapse. So tonight, in the middle of the storm, every man aboard HMS Ark Royal knew one truth. If they did not stop the Bismarck now, they might never get another chance. The Swordfish crew knew it too. They felt it with every breath, every heartbeat, every sound of the sea around them. Their aircraft shook under the wind, its wings trembling like thin paper. The men strapped themselves in, pulling tight the cold buckles of their harnesses. They could barely hear one another over the storm. Yet they had their orders. Find the Bismarck. Attack her. Disable her. Stop her from escaping. It was simple to say. But the men knew the truth. This was a mission with almost no chance of success. The Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns could fill the sky with fire. Her armor could shrug off shells. Her engines were powerful enough to outrun most ships. And the Swordfish was slow. So slow that enemy fighters sometimes had trouble shooting it down because they flew too fast and overshot their target. That slowness was sometimes a strength, but tonight, facing the world's strongest battleship, it felt like a curse. Still, the men prepared. Not because they expected to survive, but because they had no other choice. A light flashed from the deck crew. The first Swordfish moved forward. Its engine roared against the wind. Rain beat against its wings. The carrier pitched and dipped as if trying to throw the aircraft into the sea before it even took off. One of the pilots later said he felt the deck disappear under him. For a heartbeat, the Swordfish hovered between life and death, held up only by faith and momentum. Then the wind grabbed its wings. The aircraft bounced once, twice, and then it lifted into the air, swallowed by darkness. The others followed one by one. Wooden wings rising into a storm powerful enough to tear them apart. Yet there was no turning back. Far ahead of them in that black and endless sea, the Bismarck moved calmly through the waves. Her engines pushed thousands of tons of steel forward without effort. Her crew, tired but confident, believed they had escaped the British trap. Their ship had survived hit after hit. Their armor had held. Their guns were ready for another fight. They had no idea that a handful of slow biplanes were coming for them. They had no idea that their greatest weakness would soon be uncovered by chance, courage, and a single well-placed torpedo. But for now, the Bismarck sailed like a giant unaware of its fate. Inside the ship, the sound of engines hummed through the metal floors. The smell of oil, steel, and salt hung in the air. Men moved through the halls with quiet purpose. Some were confident. Some were afraid. Most were exhausted. Outside, waves crashed against the hull. Lightning flashed across the sky. And somewhere, hidden in that darkness, the Swordfish approached. Their pilots scanned the sea, searching for a shadow, a wake, a movement that did not belong to the storm. The cold air cut into their skin. Water dripped down their goggles. The engines rattled. The wings shook. But they kept flying. Perhaps this was where courage was born. Not in strength, not in certainty, but in those quiet moments when fear was still present and the mission continued anyway. The first sight of the Bismarck came suddenly. A dark shape against darker water. A giant made of angles and lines. A monster sleeping in the night. The pilot tightened his grip. The crew held their breath. They knew what came next. The Bismarck saw them. Her guns turned. Her lights flashed. And the sky exploded. Tracer fire cut through the clouds, bright red streaks racing upward. Shells burst in the air, shaking the Swordfish with shock waves. Smoke filled the night. The pilots leaned into the wind, fighting to keep their aircraft steady as metal fragments tore past them. The Swordfish had no armor. No protection. Only trust in their skill and the luck of flying so slowly that the Bismarck's calculated fire struggled to track them. Still, every second felt like a lifetime. Every explosion felt too close. The storm battered them. The guns hunted them. Yet they pushed forward inch by inch, closer to the giant that wanted to erase them from the sky. The pilot lowered the aircraft. Waves rushed toward them. The aircraft skimmed the water, almost touching it. This was the only way to avoid the worst of the fire. Fly low, stay unpredictable, trust the sea more than the sky. Another explosion ripped through the night behind them. A shock wave slammed into the Swordfish. The wings bent. The tail jerked. The pilot gritted his teeth. The gunner held on with both hands. The torpedo officer watched the dark shape ahead grow larger and larger. They were almost in range. Almost. The Bismarck's guns thundered. The sea shook. But the Swordfish kept coming. And then, in one calm, steady moment, the torpedo officer pulled the release lever. The torpedo dropped. It hit the water with a splash, then slipped beneath the waves, disappearing into the dark. Now it was out of their hands. The crew banked the aircraft away, fighting against wind and fire. Behind them, the torpedo moved silently through the sea, small, determined, unaware of history waiting ahead. It traveled in a straight line. Toward the giant. Toward the moment that would change everything. It struck the Bismarck. A metallic thud. A rush of water. A shockwave traveling through steel. For a second nothing happened. Then the ship shuddered. Deep inside her hull, machinery screamed. A rudder jammed. A shaft twisted. The once unstoppable battleship turned slightly, and could not straighten. Her fate was sealed in that moment. She could no longer flee. She could no longer choose her course. The Bismarck was wounded. The Swordfish had done it. A tiny, outdated aircraft had crippled a titan of war. But the night was not over. And the sea still had more to say. The men aboard the Bismarck felt the change first as a tremor, then as a sinking feeling of disaster. Officers rushed through the ship. Orders were shouted. Engineering teams tried to free the jammed rudder. But the damage was deep. The torpedo had struck the perfect place, a place they never expected a fragile biplane to find. A moment of silence passed through the ship. Not peace. Not calm. Something heavier. The beginning of the end. And out in the storm, the Swordfish pilots looked back and did not know yet what they had done. They only knew they were alive. And that seemed like a miracle. Far behind the Swordfish, the Bismarck groaned like a wounded animal. The sound was deep and heavy, as if the sea itself had struck her. Men inside the ship felt the vibration in their bones. They looked at each other with a confusion that quickly turned into fear. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The ship began to turn, just slightly at first, as if adjusting her course. But then the turn continued. And continued. And would not stop. Voices rose in the engine rooms. Officers rushed toward engineering compartments. Engineers checked gauges, pulled levers, shouted across the noise of the machinery. Sweat dripped down their faces despite the cold air coming through the vents. They found the problem quickly. But the truth was devastating. The rudder was jammed. It was stuck at 12 degrees to port. It could not be moved. It could not be controlled. No matter how the engines pushed, no matter how the crew tried to correct the direction, the Bismarck was locked into a slow, helpless circle. One torpedo, one single strike from a fragile biplane, had trapped the strongest battleship in the world. Word moved through the ship like a whisper carried by fear. Men stared at the metal walls around them, suddenly aware of how small they were inside the giant they had trusted. They had believed the Bismarck was invincible. They had believed nothing could pierce her armor, stop her engines, or rival her power. But now, as the ship continued her unwanted turn, they realized that fate needed only one moment, one mistake, one well-aimed torpedo to bring even giants to their knees. Above deck, officers looked out into the dark sea. The storm still raged, battering the steel hull with waves. The air smelled of salt and smoke, and the wind carried the sound of distant thunder. For a moment nothing looked different. The ship still cut through water. The guns still pointed outward. The engine still rumbled with strength. But the officers could feel it. A sinking, cold truth. They were no longer in control. The captain, Ernst Lindemann, remained calm, his voice steady even as the situation worsened. He ordered the engines to full speed, hoping the force of the water would push the rudder free. But the sea did not listen. The damage was too deep. The steel too twisted. The torpedo had struck a place that was never meant to be hit, a weakness hidden beneath armor and pride. Inside the ship the crew worked tirelessly. They climbed into the dark, narrow compartments at the stern. They struggled with equipment. They tried everything from hydraulic power to manual force. Sparks flew as they used cutting tools. The air filled with the smell of burning metal. But the rudder did not move. The Bismarck kept turning. The British did not know yet what had happened. The Swordfish pilots had returned to the Ark Royal, shaken, cold, covered in sea spray. The deck crew rushed to help them out of their aircraft. Some of the pilots were trembling, not from fear, but from the freezing wind they had faced for hours. The commander asked them what they saw, what they hit, where the torpedo landed. The men were unsure. In the chaos of fire, smoke, and rain, it was hard to see anything. But they believed the torpedo may have struck the stern. It was only a guess. No one knew how much damage had been done. They had no idea they had changed the entire war. The British Admiralty listened to the reports with cautious hope. If the attack had succeeded, even slightly, it could slow the Bismarck enough for the fleet to catch her. But they did not want to celebrate too early. They wanted proof. It came soon. A reconnaissance aircraft spotted the Bismarck. The pilot saw something strange. The ship was not sailing straight. She was turning in circles, or nearly so, moving without clear direction. This was all the confirmation the British needed. They knew now that the Bismarck was crippled. They knew she could not escape. They knew the final battle was coming. And they knew they had only one fragile aircraft to thank. The Swordfish. The news traveled quickly through British ships, a wave of excitement and disbelief. Men who had felt despair now felt a fire in their chests. They prepared their weapons. They readied their ships. The chase was almost over. The Bismarck, which had once seemed unstoppable, was now a trapped giant. Out in the Atlantic, night began to fall deeper. The storm softened, replaced by a heavy quiet. The sea stretched out like black glass under the clouds. The Bismarck continued her slow, helpless arc through the water, unaware of the thousands of sailors now moving toward her. Inside the ship, some men tried to sleep, knowing they would need strength for the coming fight. Others wrote letters home, not because they expected them to be delivered, but because the act of writing made them feel connected to life beyond the metal walls. Young sailors thought of their families, their homes, the dreams they once had. Older men closed their eyes and listened to the engines, feeling each vibration through the steel deck. Some still believed they could survive. That somehow, by strength or miracle, they would make it home. But most knew the truth. The British fleet was closing in. And the Bismarck was no longer fast enough to outrun anything. Above them, the sky opened just enough for a faint glow to pass through the clouds. It was not moonlight, it was the first hint of dawn approaching. But to the men aboard the Bismarck, the light did not bring hope. It only brought clarity. They would be found. They would be surrounded. And they would be attacked from every side. The night felt longer than any they had ever lived through. Every wave, every creak, every echo seemed louder. Some men walked the halls in silence, feeling the ship's slow turn, understanding its meaning with each step. Others remained at their stations, gripping their tools or weapons, waiting for orders they knew would soon come. The captain remained composed. He gathered his officers. They discussed strategies, possibilities, risks. But no plan could change the simple fact: the ship could not steer. They could adjust power to the engines, but that only changed the size of the circle they moved in. They were trapped in the ocean, like a single candle surrounded by the wind. The British fleet spent the night calculating their approach. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers altered course. Engines roared in the darkness. Radar screens glowed faintly in control rooms. Men loaded shells the size of small cars into massive guns, preparing for the coming fight. The weight of the moment was clear. This was not only a battle. It was a chase for justice, for vengeance, for survival. The hood had been sunk. Thousands had died. And the sailors of the Royal Navy had been waiting for this chance to strike back. Dawn slowly broke over the Atlantic. The clouds thinned. The sky shifted from black to blue-gray. The sea, restless through the night, calmed into rolling waves that reflected the new light. And in that quiet morning, the Bismarck appeared on the horizon. A dark shape. A giant with broken wings. The British fleet spread out, taking their positions. The air buzzed with tension. Officers shouted orders. Lookouts raised binoculars. Engines hummed. Guns rotated with deep mechanical groans. The final battle was minutes away. Inside the Bismarck, men braced themselves. They checked their weapons. They secured loose objects. They tightened their jackets. Some prayed quietly. Others simply breathed deeply and accepted their fate. But even now, even after everything, the crew did not surrender. They prepared to fight to the last moment. The British ships moved closer. The distance shrank. The air felt heavy, as if the whole ocean were holding its breath. Then came a silence so complete that even the sea seemed to pause. A moment frozen in time. And then, the first British gun fired. A deep, thunderous roar rolled across the ocean, echoing through the sky. A flash of fire erupted from the battleship Rodney. The shell, massive and deadly, flew through the air, cutting across the morning light. A second later, another shell. Then another. And another. The battle had begun. The Bismarck returned fire. Her guns roared in defiance, sending their shells toward the British ships. But her aim was off. Her broken rudder and uneven turn made targeting difficult. Her once perfect fighting machine was wounded, and the British could see it. Shells rained down on her deck. Metal twisted. Fire started. The ship shook under the blows. Men ran through smoke-filled corridors, choking on the thick smell of burning fuel and hot steel. Still the Bismarck fought. Every shot was a message: we will not die quietly. But the British were relentless. They had waited for this moment. They fired with precision, hitting the Bismarck again and again. Her guns were destroyed one by one. Her towers fell. Her decks tore apart. The ocean around her filled with smoke, fire, and debris. And yet, in the middle of destruction, something remarkable happened. The Bismarck did not sink. She refused to fall. She stayed afloat, even as fire covered her, even as her systems failed, even as her crew struggled to survive inside a collapsing world of steel. It was as if she wanted to live just a little longer. As if she wanted to show the world that a giant does not fall easily. But every giant has its final moment. And it was coming. The British continued their attack, determined to end the threat forever. Shells tore into the hull. Flames spread. Water rushed into compartments. The Bismarck, once the pride of the German Navy, was now a broken symbol of war's harsh truth. Even the strongest fall. Even the proudest can be humbled. And sometimes all it takes is one small, unlikely strike to change everything. The Swordfish pilots, miles away and unaware of the final battle, would later learn what they had done. Many did not believe it at first. They thought it must be a mistake, a myth, an exaggeration. How could their slow, fragile aircraft bring down a Titan? But history would remember their courage. And the Bismarck, now burning and listing in the water, was living proof of it. The end was near. And the ocean, silent and deep, waited for the giant to fall. The morning light drifted slowly across the Atlantic, touching the waves with a pale silver glow. Smoke from the battle rose into the sky like a dark pillar, carried by a gentle wind that no longer seemed to belong to war. The great noise of the guns still echoed over the water, but the rhythm had slowed. It was becoming clear now, the Bismarck was dying. From a distance, she looked like a wounded beast. Her hull burned in several places. Her forward turrets were silent, their barrels twisted or shattered. Her decks, once clean and strong, were torn open, scattered with debris and fire. Her masts leaned at strange angles, and smoke poured from her funnels in dark, heavy clouds. But still she floated. This stubbornness surprised even the British. The Rodney and King George V had fired hundreds of shells. They had struck her again and again. But the Bismarck refused to go down. Her armor held longer than anyone expected. Her compartments resisted flooding. Her crew worked tirelessly, closing bulkheads, trying to keep the ship upright. Inside the ship, the world felt like a nightmare. Darkness filled the lower decks. Smoke clouded the air. Men stumbled through hallways, past broken pipes and fallen beams. The smell of burning oil mixed with seawater. Hot metal hissed. Electric wires sparked with tiny flashes of light. Some corridors were flooded up to the knees. In others, fires crackled along the walls. Men slipped on oil-covered floors. They carried wounded shipmates, their faces blackened with smoke, uniforms torn, hands trembling from burns or shock. Yet even in the chaos they helped one another. They shouted instructions, pulled debris aside, tried to free men trapped under metal. Some sailors kept trying to repair systems that no longer mattered. Others tried to carry ammunition, though the guns they fed were already silent. Their world was collapsing around them, but they did not give up. Above them, the captain stayed at his post. He watched the sea and the enemy ships drawing closer, knowing he could not save the Bismarck. But he also knew he could not abandon her. She was more than a warship. She was a symbol of pride, of engineering, of strength. And he would stand with her until the end. The British ships continued their fire, but the tone had changed. This was no longer a battle of equals. It was now a slow, painful dismantling of a ship that could not fight back. Some British sailors felt a strange sadness as they watched. They respected the Bismarck. She had fought bravely. She had survived hits that would have destroyed any other ship. They knew the men inside her were experiencing fear and suffering beyond imagination. War brings moments like this, moments where victory and sorrow mix, where triumph feels heavy instead of joyful. The British admiral finally gave the order for torpedoes. Shells had done their work, but the Bismarck was still afloat. They would need to end it completely. Destroyers moved closer, their engines humming across the waves. They slipped between the smoke and fire, careful but determined. The sea smelled of gunpowder and oil. Pieces of metal floated on the water. The Bismarck loomed above them like a broken cliff. One destroyer, HMS Dorsetshire, came close enough for the crew to see the burned, twisted plates on the battleship's side. They could see flames licking out of shattered windows. They could hear faint shouting from inside the hull. The order was given. A torpedo launched. It hit near the stern with a deep, booming sound. Water sprayed high into the air. The Bismarck shook violently. Another torpedo hit her side. Then a third. Inside the ship, the explosions felt like earthquakes. Walls cracked. Water poured into new compartments. The lights flickered and died. Darkness swallowed everything. The end had come. The Bismarck began to roll slowly to port. The movement started gently, almost softly, as if she were simply leaning closer to the sea she had fought upon. But then the angle grew sharper. The deck tilted. Men lost their balance and slid across the floor. Tools clattered. Water rushed into the open wounds in the hull. On the upper decks, sailors climbed out into the burning air. Some jumped into the sea hoping for a chance to survive. The water was freezing, but it was the only escape left. Others stayed on the tilting deck, unable to move or unwilling to abandon their ship. And all around them the ocean roared. The British ships slowed their fire. They watched as the great battleship leaned farther and farther. The waves washed over her deck. Smoke poured from every opening. The cries of men in the water reached their ears. Then, slowly, with a deep groan that echoed across the sea, the Bismarck tipped onto her side. For a moment she hung there, half above the water, half below, like a giant deciding whether to fall. And then she went. The Atlantic swallowed her in a single, powerful motion. Water rushed over her hull. The towers sank beneath the waves. The smoke vanished into the sea. The last tip of her structure disappeared into the cold, dark depths. Within minutes she was gone. Only a patch of oil, floating debris, and the survivors in the water remained. The sea, which had been filled with fire and violence only moments earlier, became quiet again. The waves rolled steadily. The sky opened a little, letting weak sunlight fall across the scene. It was as if nature itself had paused to watch the final moment, and now it returned to its calm rhythm. British destroyers moved in to rescue survivors. Sailors threw ropes and ladders over the sides. They leaned over the rails, calling out to the men in the water. Some survivors swam toward them with weak strokes. Others floated unconscious. The cold water was brutal, stealing warmth and strength with every second. Despite their efforts, only around 100 survivors were pulled from the sea. Many more had died inside the ship. Many more were claimed by the cold water. The British sailors worked quickly, lifting men from the waves, wrapping them in blankets, giving them warm drinks, speaking to them gently despite having fought them only hours earlier. War turns enemies into humans again the moment the fighting stops. Some of the rescued sailors looked back at the water in shock. They had lived inside the Bismarck for months. They had trusted her strength. They had believed she was unbreakable. Now she was gone just like that. One moment a giant, the next only a memory sinking into darkness. Word of the sinking reached the rest of the British fleet. A quiet passed through many ships. They did not cheer. They did not shout. They simply absorbed the moment. The mission was over. The threat was gone. But the cost felt heavy. Far from the battle, in quiet rooms across Britain, officers studied reports with solemn faces. Somewhere in Germany, messages were sent, families were notified, and leaders felt the weight of losing one of their most powerful creations. In the days that followed, the story began to spread. People spoke of the Bismarck's last stand, of the bravery of her crew, of the determination of the British Navy. But one part of the story stood out above all the rest. The moment the Swordfish struck her rudder. It seemed unbelievable. Even historians later struggled to wrap their minds around it. A slow biplane, built with wood and canvas, flown by young men who fought wind more than enemy fire, had delivered the one hit that changed everything. The more people learned, the more remarkable the moment became. The Swordfish had flown through a storm. They had dodged anti-aircraft fire. They had launched torpedoes in conditions no modern pilot would accept. And somehow, against all odds, one torpedo found the exact spot needed to cripple the Bismarck's steering. It was a combination of courage, skill, luck, and fate. A moment that should not have happened, yet it did. History is full of stories like this. Stories where the smallest player makes the biggest impact, where the weak overcome the strong, where the unexpected becomes the turning point. The Swordfish pilots never saw themselves as heroes. They were men doing their duty. They did not know they had changed the war until long after the battle ended. Some were surprised. Some were humbled. Some felt the weight of the lives their actions had affected. But all of them understood one thing. Sometimes, the most impossible victories come from those who refuse to stop trying. As the days passed, the Atlantic returned to its old rhythm. The waves washed away the last traces of the battle. The surface of the sea looked peaceful again, hiding the wreck far below. Life continued. Ships sailed. Storms came and went. But deep beneath the water, the Bismarck lay on the ocean floor, silent, broken, yet still massive and powerful in her final rest. Her hull rested at a steep angle, covered in silt and shadows. Her guns, once proud and fierce, now pointed into nothingness. Her towers lay fallen. Her armor was torn. But her presence was still heavy, still commanding even in death. Divers who visited her decades later spoke of an overwhelming feeling, a mix of sadness, respect, and awe. They could see the scars from the battle. They could see the damage the torpedoes caused. They could imagine the fear and courage of the men who had been inside her as she sank. Standing before her remains, one diver said, felt like standing at the edge of history itself. The story of the Bismarck is not only the story of a ship. It is the story of human ambition, engineering, courage, pride, fear, and fate. It is a story of how the strongest machine can fall, and how the smallest force can create the biggest change. And at the heart of this story, almost forgotten at times, is the moment the Swordfish dropped a single torpedo into the dark Atlantic night. One strike that turned the path of war. One small aircraft. One torpedo. One moment that changed everything. The sea remembers. It always does. After the Bismarck sank, the ocean slowly began to close over her resting place. The waves rolled across the surface like nothing remarkable had happened. The wind calmed. The sky cleared. The world, as it always does, continued its steady motion. But the men who witnessed the final hours of the Bismarck carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. The survivors on board the British ships were given blankets, hot drinks, and whatever comfort their former enemies could provide. Some sat quietly, trembling from cold or shock. Others stared at the sea in disbelief, still expecting to see the silhouette of their ship rising from the waves. A few cried softly, unable to hide their grief. They had lived through fire, noise, terror, and darkness, and now they were alive when thousands of their shipmates were not. One young sailor from the Bismarck whispered to a British officer, "She did not deserve to die like that." The officer placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded. "No ship does. War takes much from people, but it also creates unexpected moments of humanity like this. Moments where compassion briefly rises above hatred." As the rescued sailors rested, British sailors moved silently around them, offering help without judgment. Some handed out food. Others helped treat wounds. Some simply sat beside the survivors, sharing quiet company. They did not speak the same language, but they understood each other's suffering. Meanwhile, far below them, the wreck of the Bismarck settled deeper into the cold darkness. Water filled her empty rooms. Fish drifted through broken corridors. The lights that once glowed across her decks were gone forever. The sea had claimed her, as it had claimed countless ships throughout history. News of the Bismarck's destruction reached London slowly, carried across radio lines filled with static. When the message was confirmed, there was relief, but it was a quiet relief. Even Winston Churchill, who had relentlessly ordered her pursuit, spoke of the victory with a heavy tone. He knew the ship's fall represented not just triumph, but also the tragic cost of war. In Germany, the reports were shocking. Families waited for news of loved ones, only to learn they were never coming home. Newspapers wrote of heroism, sacrifice, and loyalty. Commanders admired the Bismarck's endurance, calling it a symbol of German strength even in defeat. But behind closed doors, the truth settled in. One torpedo from an outdated aircraft had brought down the pride of the Navy. Historians later studied the event, trying to understand how such a powerful ship could be undone by such a small opponent. They looked at design flaws, the placement of armor, the structure of the rudder, and the choices made during the battle. They also studied the Swordfish aircraft itself, how something so simple could be effective against a machine built to withstand the most modern weapons of its time. They found many reasons. The Swordfish flew slow enough to confuse the Bismarck's fire control computers. The torpedo hit at the perfect angle. The storm created unpredictable conditions. And perhaps fate played its part too. But one thing was certain: courage was at the center of it all. Consider the young men aboard the Swordfish, flying through rain and wind, hearing metal whistle past them, seeing explosions all around. They did not have heavy armor or fast engines. They had no radar, no advanced systems, nothing but a strong will and a mission they believed in. They flew low over waves that could easily swallow them. They faced the strongest anti-aircraft guns in the world. They trusted their aircraft even though it felt like it could tear apart any moment. Their bravery became one of the greatest stories of the war. In quiet moments, long after the battle, many of those pilots would say they never thought of themselves as heroes. One said, "We just did what we had to. Anyone else in our place would have done the same." Another said, "I didn't feel brave. I felt cold, scared, and focused. That was enough." But history remembers them differently. The Swordfish crews showed that bravery is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is three men in a fragile aircraft, flying through a storm with only hope guiding them. The Royal Navy never forgot what they did. Their story was told again and again, not because it made for good headlines but because it reminded everyone that even the greatest machines depend on human hands, and even the smallest weapon can make the greatest difference. Over the years, as the world changed and new wars began and ended, people continued to return to the story of the Bismarck. Books were written. Documentaries were made. Veterans shared their memories. Each time the story grew deeper, more than just facts on a page. It became a lesson in history, strategy, courage, and the unpredictable nature of battle. One of the strongest lessons was this: power does not always guarantee victory. The Bismarck had strength, size, armor, speed, and firepower. She was designed to dominate the seas. And yet, it was a single moment, a single hit from a slow biplane, that sealed her fate. This moment, when studied closely, reveals something about life itself. We often believe that those with the most strength, resources, or size will win every battle. But the truth is more complex. Sometimes determination, resilience, or a tiny advantage in the right place at the right moment can change everything. Life is full of such moments, small choices, unexpected events, unlikely chances that shift the entire path of a future. In the case of the Bismarck, that moment came from the steady hands of young pilots who refused to turn back. Their courage shaped the rest of the war. If the Bismarck had escaped, she would have threatened every supply line Britain relied on. Britain might have starved. Convoys might have been destroyed. The war's outcome could have shifted in unpredictable ways. But history does not follow the path of what if. It follows the path of what actually happened. And what happened was a mixture of bravery, luck, skill, and relentless pursuit. As time passed, survivors of the Bismarck shared their stories. They spoke of fear, sadness, shock, but also pride. They talked about the final hours inside the ship, how they tried to save her, how they helped each other, how some refused to leave their posts even when the fires grew too strong. One sailor described the final tilt of the ship. He said it felt like the world itself had suddenly turned sideways. Water rushed in. Lights went out. The deck beneath his feet cracked open. He grabbed hold of a rail and felt himself sliding as the ship leaned. He remembered the sound of metal bending, the roar of water, the silence that followed. He said, "In that moment, I knew she was going down. I knew there was nothing left to do but survive." Another survivor spoke of floating in the water afterward, watching the last bubbles rise from where the ship had sunk. He said he felt strange, not grateful, not sad, but empty. "It was like losing a part of myself," he said. "She was our home. And then she was gone." Stories like this help us understand the human side of history. Too often we see battles as numbers, ships, guns, casualties, dates. But behind every number is a heartbeat. Behind every machine is a person. Behind every tragedy is a world of emotion. As the years passed, the wreck of the Bismarck remained untouched, lying silently in the deep. It became not just a grave but a reminder of the cost of war and the fragile line between strength and vulnerability. When explorers finally found her in 1989, resting more than 15,000 feet below the surface, the world saw her again for the first time in nearly 50 years. Cameras drifted across her broken hull. They showed the scars of the battle, the torn metal, the fallen towers. Even in her ruin, she looked powerful. The images touched many people. Veterans watched them with tears in their eyes. Historians studied every frame. Families of lost sailors saw the resting place of their loved ones. It was a quiet moment, but a meaningful one. The explorers said the water around the wreck felt cold, still, and strangely peaceful. There was no noise, no movement except the slow drift of deep-sea life. The Bismarck lay tilted on her side as if still sailing through time. In documentaries and articles, people often described her as sleeping. A giant resting under the endless weight of the ocean. The Swordfish aircraft that changed her fate also became symbols of history. Some were preserved in museums, their wings and engines carefully restored. Visitors looked at them with amazement. How could something so simple, so fragile, bring down something so mighty? Children pointed at them with wide eyes. Older visitors stood quietly, reading the plaques and imagining the night when the Swordfish flew through a storm toward the Bismarck. Pilots who saw them in museums felt a rush of memories: cold wind, spray from waves, the shaking of the wings, the glare of searchlights. One pilot said, "I look at that plane and I still feel the seat beneath me, the fear in my stomach. I remember thinking, this is madness. But I flew anyway." History often remembers big machines, powerful weapons, and massive battles. But sometimes the heart of a story is not the giant. It is the small force that dares to challenge that giant. The Swordfish was such a force. The story of the Bismarck is more than a war story. It is a reminder that no machine is truly invincible, and no moment is too small to make a difference. It teaches us that courage can come from unexpected places and that fate sometimes favors the daring. And it teaches us one more thing: even the strongest fall, and when they do, the world learns something new about itself. The ocean continued to hold the Bismarck in its deep, dark arms. Above, life went on. Ships sailed. Storms passed. History moved forward. But somewhere below, a memory slept, of guns, fire, courage, fear, and one torpedo that changed everything. Long after the war ended, the story of the Bismarck remained alive in the minds of sailors, historians, and ordinary people. It became a legend, part tragedy, part triumph, part lesson. The world had changed, but the memories of that night in the Atlantic stayed sharp, like a scar that never fades. Some veterans revisited the ocean later in life, standing on the decks of peaceful ships sailing across the same waters where the Bismarck once roared. They looked out at the waves and felt the cold wind on their faces. And in their eyes you could see that the past still lived inside them. One British sailor said, "When I look at this sea, I see ghosts." He was not talking about fear. He was talking about memory of friends, comrades, enemies, and moments that shaped a lifetime. For many survivors of the Bismarck, rebuilding life after the war was not easy. They returned home to towns and families that had changed. Some carried physical scars. Others carried emotional ones. They dreamed of fire and water. They woke at night hearing the sound of explosions that were no longer real. Yet they continued living because life has always asked people to move forward, even after the hardest storms. Some wrote about their experiences. Others tucked their memories away, sharing them only in old age. Many felt pride in having served on such a powerful ship, even though the ending had been tragic. They spoke of comradeship, loyalty, duty, things that go deeper than victory or defeat. Their memories added a human layer to a story often told through machinery and tactics. Their voices reminded the world that inside every ship, behind every decision, there are people with hopes, fears, dreams, and families waiting at home. The British veterans carried different memories. For them, the fight against the Bismarck was a desperate mission at a time when Britain was struggling for survival. The island nation was facing starvation if supply lines were cut. Every convoy mattered. Every ship mattered. They remembered the tension of the chase, the fear of losing her, the anger after the hood exploded, and the relief when the Bismarck was cornered. But many also remembered the respect they felt at the end. They saw the courage of the German sailors. They saw their determination. Even in battle, respect can exist between enemies. One Royal Navy officer said, "When the Bismarck sank, it felt like closing a chapter. But it did not feel like a celebration. It felt like watching a mountain fall." The commanders who planned the pursuit studied every detail afterward. They wrote reports that filled thick books. They analyzed strategy, timing, weather, weapons, and decisions made on the spot. Historians later examined these reports with great interest, trying to understand what the battle meant, not just tactically but emotionally, politically, and symbolically. Some said the chase of the Bismarck represented the turning point of pride. Others said it was a reminder that no single ship, no matter how powerful, can change the course of a war alone. Still others saw it as an example of how determination and cooperation can overcome even the greatest threat. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. The torpedo hit on the rudder was the most critical moment. It was the point where fate shifted. Without that hit, the Bismarck might have escaped. She might have caused havoc on the Atlantic lanes. She might have become a nightmare that lasted months, even years. That hit was the moment where an impossible story became possible. As the decades rolled on, new generations learned about the Bismarck through school lessons, documentaries, films, and books. But they learned even more when divers finally saw the wreck with their own eyes. The images were haunting. The ship lay on her side at a steep angle, her bow buried in silt. The deck, once alive with movement, was silent. The turrets, once aimed at distant enemies, were frozen in death. Holes from shells and torpedoes were still visible. But in many ways the ship looked as if she had sunk only yesterday. The deep ocean preserved her shape, her scars, and her story. Scientists studied the wreck with respect. They treated it not only as a piece of engineering but as a grave. They spoke softly in interviews, aware that thousands of men had died aboard her. They did not touch certain areas. They did not disturb personal belongings. They filmed with care, knowing every object had meaning. One explorer said, When you see the Bismarck underwater, you feel a presence. Not a ghost, but a memory, a reminder of how fragile power can be. Another described descending toward the wreck as falling through time. Down there, 15,000 feet below the surface, there is no sound. No light except what the submersible carries. No waves, no wind, no voices. Only pressure, darkness, and the quiet shape of a once mighty ship. It is a strange feeling, he said, to see something so huge lying so still. A machine built for war, now part of the seafloor. A symbol of human strength, now humbled by the deep. These underwater images brought new understanding to the world. They revealed how violent the last battle had been. They showed the precise points where shells tore open the armor. They confirmed that the torpedoes from British ships had delivered fatal damage. But they also revealed something else. The hit from the Swordfish had indeed crippled the rudder. The damage was clear. The twisting of metal told its own story. And so, the story of the Swordfish gained new power. The tiny aircraft became not just a side note, but a centerpiece. Historians wrote about it. Documentaries highlighted it. People who saw the preserved Swordfish in museums looked at it with deeper respect. Parents brought their children and said, "This little plane changed history." And the children stared in disbelief, trying to understand how something that looked so simple could defeat something that looked so terrifying. It was a powerful lesson in contrast. But the story of the Swordfish is not only about machinery. It is about the men who flew them. Over time, records of their interviews and diaries came to light. Many of the pilots described feeling fear in ways they had never admitted before. One said, "My hands were shaking so much I had to press them against the seat to stop it." Another said, "The wind felt like it was trying to tear us apart." They spoke of the cold, the heavy rain, the deafening sound of the Bismarck's guns, the bright flashes of explosions, the shaking of the wings as shells burst close. They spoke of moments where they thought they were going to die. Yet they flew on. One crewman described looking down at the sea below them and thinking how easy it would be to disappear in those dark waves. "But then," he said, "I remembered my family, and I thought, if I can do one thing today that matters, I will." For many of them, the moment after dropping the torpedo felt like a strange calm. They turned away from the ship and felt the sky open around them. The danger was still there, but the hardest part was done. They did not know if the torpedo had hit. They did not know what damage it caused. They only knew they had survived long enough to return home. Later, when they learned the outcome, some were shocked. Some were proud. Some cried. Their mission became one of the most famous airstrikes in naval history. Yet many of them lived quiet lives afterward, rarely speaking about it unless asked directly. Some returned to farming. Others became teachers, engineers, or shopkeepers. Their courage had shaped the war, but they continued living ordinary lives. This is one of the quiet truths of history. Many of the most extraordinary acts are done by people who never see themselves as extraordinary. As years passed, families of the Swordfish crews displayed medals, photographs, and letters in their homes. Some were kept in boxes. Some were framed on walls. Some were shown to grandchildren who listened with wide eyes. Those grandchildren grew up hearing stories of a night when canvas wings carried courage into a storm. A night when the fate of a giant turned on a single hit. And they realized something powerful. History is not only shaped by strength. It is shaped by will. When we look at the sinking of the Bismarck, we see machines, strategy, maps, and battles. But behind all of it, we see something deeper. We see the courage of sailors holding a breaking ship together. We see the determination of pilots flying through terror. We see the grief of those who survived and the silence of those who did not. We see human beings, fragile, brave, uncertain, determined, caught in a moment far bigger than themselves. War often hides humanity behind noise and destruction. But stories like the Bismarck bring that humanity back into focus. They show us how people act when pushed to their limits. They show us how small actions can shape the world. They remind us that even in chaos, courage can rise. And in a strange way, the story of the Bismarck also shows us something about peace. When the guns fell silent, when the fires died, when the ocean covered the last wreckage, the people who remained, on both sides, learned something about understanding. The British sailors who pulled survivors from the water did not see enemies. They saw young men who had suffered. The survivors who climbed aboard British decks did not see monsters. They saw rescuers. It is a moment that repeats through history. After the fighting ends, humanity reappears. The Bismarck is remembered today not just for her power, but for what her story teaches about life, courage, and the fragile line between victory and loss. And though she lies deep under the ocean, far from the world above, she remains a silent teacher. A reminder that the sea takes everything eventually. But the stories we tell, those remain. Time has a way of softening the edges of history. The pain fades even if the memories stay sharp. New generations grow up far from the battles that once shaped the world. The oceans that swallowed ships continue to move, calm and endless, as if they never tasted fire. And yet, some stories remain powerful no matter how many years pass. The story of the Bismarck is one of those stories. It is not simply a record of machines and tactics. It is a story of courage on both sides. A story of strength and vulnerability. A story of fate turning on a single moment, on a single torpedo dropped from a fragile biplane flying through a storm. People today look at old photographs of the Swordfish. They see a small aircraft with fabric wings, an open cockpit, and a slow, shaky engine. It seems almost impossible that such a machine once flew into the face of the most feared battleship of its time. Yet it did. And in doing so, it changed the shape of history. What makes the story powerful is not just the final outcome, the sinking of the Bismarck, but the human spirit behind it. The courage of young pilots who took off into a storm knowing they might not return. The determination of sailors aboard the Bismarck who fought until the very last moment to save their ship. The teamwork of an entire navy working together across hundreds of miles of ocean. This story is filled with fear, bravery, hope, and tragedy. It reminds us that war is never simple. It is never just good versus evil. It is people against people, each believing they are doing what is right. Each carrying their own dreams, their own families, their own fears. When we look back on the events of that night and the days that followed, we realize that the ocean does not care about human struggles. It swallows everything without judgment. It holds wrecks and memories side by side, silent and unchanging. The Bismarck rests in darkness now, far beyond the reach of light. But she is not forgotten. Her story is told in museums, books, classrooms, and documentaries. It is taught to remind us of the cost of war, the power of chance, and the importance of courage. But there is another lesson hidden beneath the waves. A lesson about how fragile even the greatest power can be. The Bismarck was a titan, massive, strong, almost unbeatable. But she fell because of one small weakness on one stormy night. A weakness revealed not by a larger ship, not by a stronger weapon, but by a tiny aircraft flown by ordinary men. This lesson goes beyond history. It reaches into our lives today. It reminds us that no matter how big a problem seems, no matter how strong an enemy appears, there is always a chance, always a moment, when things can change. It reminds us that even the smallest effort can create a turning point. Even the simplest action can matter. And it reminds us that courage is not measured by size, but by the heart behind it. When the explorers filmed the wreck of the Bismarck deep under the sea, viewers around the world felt something unexpected. Respect. Not for war but for the men who lived through it. For the strength of the ship. For the people who built her. For the men who fought on both sides. The cameras drifted over broken gun turrets, twisted railings, darkened corridors. They showed scars left by explosions, holes punched by shells, metal torn by fire. And yet they also showed something peaceful. The ocean had wrapped the Bismarck in silence. The fish moved around her without fear. The sand had begun to claim her edges. She had returned to nature. Time had turned a war machine into a quiet monument. The Swordfish aircraft, on the other hand, live on in museums. Their wings are cleaned and restored. Their engines are polished. People stand in front of them and imagine the night they flew through wind and rain, carrying torpedoes heavier than the aircraft seemed capable of lifting. Parents lift their children so they can see the cockpit. Pilots, now old and gray, smile as they remember the feeling of the open air. Engineers admire the simplicity of the design. And everyone who sees the Swordfish feels a quiet awe. Because these small machines remind us of something important. that greatness does not always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like persistence. Sometimes it looks like daring. Sometimes it looks like a fragile aircraft flying low over the waves, heading toward a giant of steel and fire. And sometimes it looks like three young men willing to take a chance because someone had to. In the decades that followed the war, ceremonies were held in memory of the Bismarck and her crew. Floral wreaths were dropped into the Atlantic. Moments of silence were observed. Veterans from both sides attended these events. Some shook hands, their eyes filled with emotion. They did not speak of victory or defeat. They spoke of memories, of friends lost, of moments that shaped their youth. They spoke of the sound of gunfire, the cold of the sea, the fear in their hearts, and the relief of survival. One British veteran said, "We were enemies then. But now we are simply old men who lived through the same storm." A survivor of the Bismarck nodded and replied, "And the sea kept us all." This simple exchange captured the heart of the story, an understanding that time heals what war once broke. As the world continued to change, new conflicts arose, new technologies were built, and new ships crossed the oceans. But the story of the Bismarck and the Swordfish remained, not because of the machines, but because of the humanity behind them. Teachers used the story to explain courage. Writers used it to explore fate. Filmmakers used it to show the power of determination. And people everywhere found meaning in the idea that a single action taken bravely can change the course of history. Perhaps this is why the story continues to matter. Because it reflects something inside all of us. The belief that even in the face of overwhelming odds, there is hope. The belief that no matter how dark the night, someone somewhere is fighting to make a difference. The belief that giants can fall and small wings can change the world. As we return to the present moment, as the narration slowly quiets, imagine once more the stormy night when the Swordfish took flight. Imagine the sound of the wind, the sting of the rain, the shaking of the wings. Imagine the young pilot holding the controls with frozen hands. And imagine the torpedo falling into the sea, moving silently through the dark water. One small shape against a giant. One moment against history. One strike that turned the impossible into reality. The Bismarck sleeps now, deep in the cold, silent Atlantic. The Swordfish sit in museums, warmed by lights and admiration. But the story they share, the night they met, the moment they changed each other, lives on. Not as a tale of machines. Not as a tale of war. But as a tale of courage, chance, fate, and the quiet strength of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. And so the ocean keeps its secrets. The wreck rests in the dark. The waves move above it as they always have. History continues. But the story of the Bismarck remains, etched into time, remembered by all who hear it, carried like a whisper across the endless, restless sea.